Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the DLHS Collaboratory. So I'm Julie Lemang. I'm the Associate Dean for Clinical Research and the Executive Director of MICHR, which is the Michigan Institute for Clinical and Health Research. And the Department of DLHS and MICHR are co-sponsoring today's workshop. So MICHR, the Michigan Institute for Clinical and Health Research, it's, for those of you who are not familiar, it's funded by the National Institutes of Health. And so most big universities around the country have one of these institutes. And our mission is to improve the efficiency and quality and speed with which discovery is translated into things that improve people's health in the community, in the healthcare setting, all over. And so you can imagine that that process of translation, it starts from molecules and goes all the way to how do you get those healthcare solutions out into communities. So we're very lucky because the National Institutes of Health, in response to demand from taxpaying citizens, has really pushed the MICHRs around the country to really up our game in implementation science. And so we are so lucky to have one of the best implementation science groups in the country here at the University of Michigan. And so they were really central. Amy's not even looking at me. And I'm like, Amy, thank you for your leadership. We were very lucky to have Amy be part of our application. And so Amy Kilborn is directing our dissemination and implementation science catalyst at MICHR, which our goal with that program is to try to improve the or support the science of implementation and the practice of implementation. And we all know that in order to do implementation of discoveries well, you have to co-develop those solutions with the community and the end user of the discovery that you're trying to implement. So without further ado, I just want to welcome you all. I'm really looking forward to what you all come up with today in your workshop and the ideas you put forward. And I guess I will now turn it over to Chuck Friedman. Thank you for being here, everyone. It's good to see you.
Thanks, Julie. Good morning and welcome, everyone. I made some comments at, I don't know what it was the opening session of the Implementation Science Network / D&I Catalyst / maybe other things that are related. And I talked about how I was at a meeting of interested people from many institutions that have these grants, these clinical translational science award grants like MICHR. And I told the story, which some of you heard because you were there, of a talk that was given by the director of NCATS, the NIH institute that sponsors the CTSA program, that was very much focused on the very early stages of translational science, and it was full of bright, shiny stuff and not people stuff. And she gave a great talk, and everybody was very impressed. But then she asked if there were any questions, and one hand went up, and it was a very erudite-looking person who stood up and said, well, this is all well and good, but this isn't the problem we have. We have plenty of good ideas, plenty of things around that will improve health. The problem is getting people to use them and use them well. And so we can learn from the use how to do it even better. And the assembled erupted in applause. It was one of these great moments you wish you had recorded for posterity. So it is in that spirit that I welcome you, because that's what this workshop is all about. And even though this was not distributed at that meeting, I bring you an artifact. And for good luck, And out of a sense of camaraderie and shared purpose, I'm going to pass this around, and I want everybody to touch it. Do not kiss it. It is unsanitary. And maybe it isn't even sanitary to touch it. Maybe you should touch it with your elbow in the spirit of the pandemic. But this says, but we have always done it this way. But there's a difference. There's a Ghostbusters diagonal strike-through on it, and which I think captures a lot of the spirit of what we're going to be doing here today. So I'll start over there, and we will pass it around, and to, as I said, promote a sense of solidarity and common purpose here today. I want all of you to touch it with a piece of clothing, not your hand, now that I think about it. And let's have a great morning. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, Chuck, and for Julie for introducing us, and thanks to all of you for being here. And I am looking forward. This is going to be a really exciting morning. I want to see some great implementation science being built. And to really start this off, we have a couple of really great speakers, and then later on we're going to do breakout sessions. And your job, exactly as Chuck said, think outside the box, build some great implementation science, and be brave about it. Don't let the fact that sometimes we get science-y when we talk about these things limit you, because you are all implementation scientists by heart. You all know how to do things. If you're a parent, if you have taken care of anyone in your family, if you've been a community member, if you've basically had to solve problems, anything like that, you know how to do this stuff. It's very intuitive, and we're here to demystify it. That's our job. And we're here to really move forward and make sure that when we work with community partners, what we design is what we do. And basically, we want to break down those barriers. So I'm going to be introducing Dr. Piatt, Gretchen Piatt, who's our first speaker, who will then introduce our keynote speakers, and then I'll come back and then talk about what the breakout sessions are going to be about. But basically, I just also want to take this time to first thank Lisa, Kathy, and Eli, and Veronica, and Celeste, and our implementation science team between our Department of Learning Health Sciences and MICHR. We have Rama, we have John, and Gretchen and myself really being part of this great group. And we're here to grow more implementation scientists because, again, it's all, you have it in here. You know, basically, we're going to see that come out and explode today. So I'll first introduce Dr. Piatt, and then you'll be hearing some really interesting talks today, and hopefully that'll get you jazzed up and going out there and designing all the implementation science you want to do. So Gretchen is professor and vice chair of our Department of Learning Health Sciences and also with the School of Public Health. I don't know, I mean, there's so much I can say about Gretchen. She's just been a great leader and role model for me personally about how to really be able to build this really great team here. But she runs like two great centers. She's a co-lead of the Diabetes Translational Center as well as MELSTAR, which I forget what it stands for, but it's our new center on learning health systems. And she's an internationally renowned implementation scientist, has done a great work in community-based implementation science around Michigan and elsewhere. And I'll just stop there because I can just go on and on. But Gretchen, please take it away. Okay.
Thank you, Amy. That was very generous of you. Good morning, everybody. It's nice to see everyone here. I'm so glad that we had a great turnout, and I think I'm seeing so many familiar faces, so thank you for joining us this morning. So my job in the next 10-ish minutes is to really just level set all of us in terms of what the heck is implementation science and what do we mean when we're talking about it, because I think oftentimes people are implementing things, they're implementing interventions and programs and on, but there's not a sense of what is the science behind it. So let's sort of dive in. And I always like to start by just getting it out there of, let's define it. Let's define what implementation science is. And If you Google it real quick, you're going to see many, many different definitions. The one that you'll predominantly see is that it's the study of the methods to promote the integration of research findings and evidence into healthcare policy and practice. And that's great, and that makes a ton of sense. But I think if you focus on that last definition on the slide, this was a definition that was developed by a colleague of many of ours, Dr. Ann Sales, who was at Michigan and now is at the University of Missouri. She defines implementation science as the study of human behavior under organizational constraints, or human behavior change, I should say, under organizational constraints. And I think this really nails it. Because regardless of what project we're working on, in what setting, and what population, we're all focused on changing behavior in some way, shape, or form. Whether it's the patient, whether it's the clinician, whether it's the health system, and there's constraints all around that behavior change. And really, implementation science is studying that. So sometimes I think that when we're talking about implementation science and we're talking about what it is exactly, it's sometimes helpful to use some very non-scientific language to put this in perspective. So when you hear any of us, or anyone in general, talk about an intervention or an innovation or a practice, an evidence-based solution, that is simply the thing that we're talking about. When you hear about effectiveness research, that is simply whether that thing works or not. Is it improving things? Implementation research looks at how best to help people and places and settings do that thing. And then probably the cornerstone of implementation science is implementation strategies. And we're going to get into that as the morning goes on, but really, it took me forever to understand, first of all, what the heck an implementation strategy was. But once I did, it's simply, it's the stuff that we do to try to help people and places do the thing. So it's the how. It's just how we're doing it. And then finally, main implementation outcomes are how much and how well we do that thing. We're not necessarily focused so much on, did someone's weight improve? Did someone's blood pressure improve? We're more focused on how much did it improve? Can it be improved in other settings, et cetera, et cetera. And I think as this is preaching to the choir, but we all know that there is this immense need for this work. And the reason behind it is because research is so slow. And, folks who are doing very traditional randomized controlled trials, fantastic work, but they're slow and they're expensive. And the most common reason that we see in the literature for evidence not being adopted into practice is that because people don't see it as relevant. And that is probably the biggest barrier that implementation science aims to fix or improve. And then I don't have to tell anyone here that, yes, it takes long, and by long, we're talking about 17 years. So one of the main questions when we think about foundational concepts in implementation science is, how do we operationalize it? Like, what does it mean to do implementation science? What does it mean to be an implementation scientist? And I like to sort of break it down into 4 different components. So there's 4 components to this that we rely on: assessment, preparation, implementation, and evaluation. And for those of you in the room who are students, you've all seen this, so I'm not just making stuff up when I talk about it in class. So when we think about assessing or assessment, there's 2 main components of assessment in implementation science. There's figuring out what is the evidence. So when I say evidence, this is, interventions, practices, programs, et cetera. But there's a whole continuum of evidence. And evidence goes anywhere from very subjective evidence, which could be case reports, could be physicians' opinions, other clinicians' opinions, all the way to very objective evidence, where we rely on the results of systematic reviews, meta-analyses, et cetera, et cetera. The main thing to take away here from what is the evidence in this assessment component is that the less robust the body of evidence, the more important it is to evaluate it. So, you know, we're really thinking when anyone is doing a project and you're digging into the literature, you're looking for those gaps. And you're looking for those gaps because you know that it's so important to then go on to evaluate why these gaps exist. The other component of assessment is understanding who your stakeholders are. And this figure here is a figure that can be expanded on quite a bit, and we don't have time to get into that today. But a very nice way of understanding and sort of putting it into an applied way of thinking about it is drawing a 2x2 table. On the x-axis, you have level of interest. On the y-axis, you have level of influence. Excuse me. And you're able to then plot your stakeholders onto that table, and it helps you to focus your efforts into which groups of folks need the most effort from you. So really, we're really focused on this upper right-hand corner of the table where these are your key influencers. This also overlays very, very nicely onto the concept of a learning community in learning health systems. So I see it as a tool to use this in learning community work. The next step as we operationalize implementation science is focused on preparation. And there's two main components of this preparation step. One is fidelity and one is adaptation. And if you think about these two, so I mean, first of all, maintaining fidelity is extremely important, as we all know. It's, you know, you're really focused on not compromising your program's effectiveness. Adapting is something else that's hugely important, especially in this field, because you need to adapt your interventions or your practices or programs to the setting that you're working in, to the audience that you're working with, to the culture that, you know, of the group who you're working with. But these two are always at odds with each other, over and over and over again. And I sometimes describe this as like a Batman versus Superman paradigm, because Batman by himself is great and Superman by himself is great, and they're always fighting with each other. And all we want to do is to get Batman and Superman to get along, so that they're able to then have more power to move things forward. And that's exactly what we think about with fidelity and adaptation. It has to be, we have to mix them together and combine them in order to get the best result. And then we get to implement. And this is sort of where, and it makes sense because, you know, we're talking about implementation science. But these frameworks that you hear so much about and these strategies that you hear so much about, these are really the cornerstones to the field. The frameworks allow us to, in a methodical way, move through how we are implementing a project. And we know that there are process frameworks, there's determinants frameworks, there's evaluation frameworks, and there's so many of them. I mean, there's hundreds of them. And there's no right or wrong framework. And the other thing is that if you don't use a framework in your work, that doesn't mean you're not doing implementation science. And I think that that's so important to just put it out there. You know, very traditional people in the field would say you must you must be using the CFR or you must be using the TDF. You're still doing implementation science, even if you're not using those. In terms of strategies, again, these are the ways that we do the thing. It's the how. So we're really focused with implementation strategies on what it's going to take to improve outcomes like acceptability, like adoption, those sort of traditional implementation science outcomes. And I'm not sure, hopefully that's not too small to read up here. These are just examples of strategies. Like I said, it took me forever to understand what the heck a strategy was. But it's simply things like that we're already doing: educational programs, coaching, community engagement, convening teams. They are just the ways that we're doing the thing. And then finally, well, not finally, but sort of finally, in the evaluation component, which is the last component we look at as we operationalize the science. Like I said, we're not as focused anymore on does someone's blood pressure get better, because we already know that it does. Or does someone lose weight? We already know that they do. But what we're focused on are things like, is the program being implemented and as it was designed? Are the inputs and outputs sufficient to achieve the outcomes? And on and on. And you could see this, this wheel, it comes from a paper by Enola Proctor, who is one of the great leaders in our field. And she has these 8 outcomes that really just do a very nice job of getting us to understand is the evidence, is it working? Like, is the program working? Is what we're implementing working? Is it feasible? Is it appropriate? Is it acceptable? And then finally, in that same vein, when I talk to clinicians especially, these are the 2 biggest questions that I tend to get. So, can my work be sustained, and can it be scaled up? And the answer is yes, and those are 2 implementation science outcomes, sustainability and scale. It can be sustained, and there are a variety of different methods and ways for the work to be sustained. And then, can it be scaled? Again, the answer is yes, but scaling might not look like what you're used to it looking like. There's 3 different ways to scale something. One is when you scale horizontally. So if you implement a best practice alert into an EHR on one unit in a hospital, scaling horizontally would mean implementing it in another unit down the hall or, up one floor. That's scaling horizontally, and that's usually what we think of when we think about scaling or scaling up. But there's also scaling in depth, and there's also scaling vertically. When you scale in depth, that means you're adding on components to a program or an intervention that can strengthen it. So that is what we talk about when we're talking about scaling up in depth. Scaling vertically is really like implementation science endgame. It's the ultimate thing that we're looking to do, because scaling vertically means changing policy and thinking about just different jurisdictions for policy-based changes. So really, I tend to think of it anyway, when we move into that policy world, that's really the goal of the majority of our work. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions you might have. I'm not sure whether we're doing that or whether we're moving straight on.
You have like a couple minutes.
Oh, all right, cool. Yeah, please.
I think, some of the communities where implementation of interventions, let's say, might be most needed, might be the same communities who are not included
agreed,
So
for sure.
is that where that adaptation comes in?
Exactly. There is no way in the world that if you take a piece of evidence that was implemented across the street over here, if you take it to a federally qualified health center in Detroit, that it's going to work. And that's where we get into that adaptation phase. I mean, it is extremely important for us to be thinking about implementing evidence into communities that we know haven't had it, or where evidence hasn't been demonstrated. Yeah.
Gretchen?
Yeah.
I was a little surprised when you said that the main reason that things are not implemented is because the research doesn't seem relevant. I would have said number one is money, and number two is, hey, I don't want to change.
Yeah.
Do those two things drive the other one? Is that why the research isn't relevant, because it costs
It
money
could
and I
be.
don't want to change?
Yeah, I mean, it could be, for sure. I think at the end of the day, what I have seen anyway over the course of time is that all is great as long as, yeah, there's grants that are supporting it. There's a PI who's, doing their thing and implementing. But when it's time to get it into practice and to sustain it in the long term, there seems to be a lot of feelings of, well, do we really need this? Like, it was great to have it, but do we really need to keep doing this? Like, is it really that relevant? So yeah, but I do think that those two components drive a lot of those feelings around relevance. Anything else? Okay.
Gretchen?
Yeah, Chuck.
Yeah, so to Ed's point,
Mhm.
you didn't use the word infrastructure
Mhm.
in your comments, but I think to the money point, there does, for sustainable change, need to be an infrastructure that is able to provide the resources to sustain the change.
100%.
Because, especially if the innovation is supported by a grant, that grant's going to end.
100%. Yep.
So I think that's, not that it's a solution, but I think it points to what needs to be in place
Right.
for innovations to be sustainable in an environment.
Totally agree. I think, and that's, again, it's a bit small, so I think you all probably have the copies of the slides. But you could see some of those ways in which things become sustainable. And number one on that list is funding stability. If the infrastructure isn't in place and doesn't have the funds to keep the work going, it becomes difficult. So I see Lisa lurking. So I am going to wrap up, but I'm happy to answer any questions, as throughout the day if you have them. And I'm also going to introduce Susan. Is that why you're lurking? Okay. Oh, okay. So it's my pleasure to introduce Susan Murphy and Alexandra Harper. So Dr. Murphy is a professor in the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation and of Internal Medicine in the Rheumatology Division here at U of M. She's also the director of the Behavioral Research, Innovation, and Support Program at MICHR, and her research interests involve developing and translating relevant and effective interventions into practice to optimize the management of chronic conditions. And there's lots more written about Susan that I could read. The one thing I will say is that she and I have been working together for a few years now. She has a really wonderful project that is focused on training community health workers on doing research and providing research information to participants. With her today, who will be is Alexandra Harper. So Dr. Harper is a postdoctoral research fellow in PM&R, physical medicine and rehab. here at U of M, and she has 10 years of experience as an occupational therapist and completed her PhD in rehab science at my alma mater at the University of Pittsburgh. And she is focused largely on leveraging community engagement and implementation science methods to enhance the design and conduct of pragmatic clinical trials to facilitate the consistent delivery of evidence-based practices. So with that, I welcome both of you to the podium, and thank you so much for being here.
Good morning. I'm thrilled to be here because this project has been a labor of love, and I see people that work on the project in various roles here today, and I just want to thank you and please take part in the success and ask questions, and just happy to kind of inform you where we're at now. So in the spirit of talking about relevance, I feel like I'm going to be imparting a lot of different ways that we're trying to make this training as relevant as possible. And I think one of the things that I keep coming back to is what's very common sense of we just have to ask our end users all the time about everything, because I don't know what's going to be relevant for a community health worker in Texas or California or Florida or Michigan. I don't know if Spanish is your first language, how you will perceive the course and how it would be different from an English version. And that's really what we're doing in this project. So I'll tell you a little bit more about it. If I can advance the slides. No. There we go. So just to kind of give it context, how do things get lost in translation? Because our goal is to really, all the work that we're doing, all of the funding that we get, we want to make sure that what we're doing actually matters and actually translates into real life. So we spent several years working in this development phase to get a training to a phase where people actually would think it's worthwhile enough to have uptake and help us work on the sustainability of that. We think that things get lost in translation when they don't involve community partners. And in our project, for the lack of appropriate role-specific training of research members. So in the spirit of team science, when we're talking about we need to have different kinds of people on your team, and we know that community health workers can be very effective in improving research quality and helping to recruit participants. It's very important for us to have training for these people that is beyond peers training and human subjects training. This is not the logistics kinds of training, and it's not designed really for many people. It's designed for researchers who know research jargon, who can regurgitate the Belmont Principle and all of the history of ethics, but really when it comes down to it, community health workers need to understand, what can I do to support this study? And once we give them training, there needs to be some mentorship along the way. People have questions and they need to be supported in teams. So these are the things that we were thinking about in this project. For community health workers and promotoras, which are the Spanish-speaking community health workers, they have a really important role in improving health research. And actually, there's an emerging body of literature that shows they actually contribute to the quality of research. They can help improve the intervention quality. They can help improve recruitment and retention. They're very important members of the team that often no one gives attention to. They want people to participate. They want them to be there, but don't really support them in their role. We know from the literature some of the problems that has resulted, which I think that we should own as researchers, that we need to remedy. It's not the problem of the community health worker that they don't understand randomization. It's really the role of us is to provide the appropriate training for people to do their jobs. So we know that some of the challenges are that people don't really understand what randomization is in community settings, which is kind of hard to understand. They might coerce people and not understand that they're coercing people. And the whole idea about privacy, of where you have conversations in real world settings, or confidentiality of data if they're collecting data. These are things that we have the opportunity to really get very specific on how community health workers can do this when they're on teams. So our project goal was to develop a training that was effective and culturally and linguistically tailored and competency-based for what we're calling research best practices, which is kind of the good clinical practice of our space of behavioral research. And we felt like this would contribute to improved research translation if we can really kind of hone on reducing the issues with study rigor, helping to build teams and helping people feel like they're parts of teams, and to improve the conduct of the study. So a bit more about research best practices. This is a little bit of our own jargon, but really it's the logistics of how to run research. So it's not really the ethics behind it as much as it's how do you uphold the ethical principles, and how can you do some of the practices that you will need to do in the study in a rigorous way. And in my work here as a professor, we am part of MICHR. I had the opportunity to lead the development of the social and behavioral research best practices course that some of you may have taken. It's if you are on a research team that has an NIH grant or federally funded grant, sometimes they require people to take this training, as they would require an MD to take the good clinical practice training if you're doing an FDA-regulated trial. So this is like the behavioral research version of that, and it's at the university, you can take it. But from there, there's certain competencies that are appropriate for people to do studies well in the community or in any kind of setting that are doing behavioral research. And we took those competencies and we kind of translated like, well, what would a community health worker in Promotora need to know related to this? And largely these are like practices around study conduct in the field. What I'm showing you here is the online version of both of these courses. So we had an NIH grant. It's a UL1 grant with 3 different centers. And our goals were to develop this research course in English and in Spanish. And we also wanted it to be very usable for people. So we were trying to figure out, well, how can we make this more usable? So one way was to have an online version where people could take it like a course, or a facilitated peer-led training where people could take it kind of in mini groups and discuss each module and do the same content but with a peer learner. We then want to demonstrate the effectiveness of that, which we have done with the online course and the facilitated training, and disseminate the training because now we have a thing and we want to figure out kind of the next step of what Dr. Piatt was talking about is like, now we want to see if we can sustain it and figure out what our implementation strategies are. So largely the point that we're at was we have something developed, we're testing out implementation, and then we hope to do this next phase in another grant, hopefully, that would test out implementation strategies. And in this AIM-3, we have a website, and we felt strongly about having it be broadly accessible to anyone and free. So we have a website that will support our online course as well as the materials for the facilitated training. And Dr. Harper will be talking to you about our secondary implementation where we're kind of testing the waters with a couple pilot sites to see if we just give them the training, the facilitated training, we're going to see how do they do and what kinds of resources do they need and we have a whole thing that Dr. Harper will be talking to you about how we're going to assess that. So this is what our partnership structure looks like. The UL1 grants are where you partner with other sites, and they're the sites that fund the MICHR type centers. So at Michigan, we are the kind of the lead site, and then we have University of Florida. Linda Kotler, if you know about community health workers, she has done a lot in the space to try to bridge community health workers as being very important in collecting research outcomes. They have a thing called Health Street where people can come, community members can come, and community health workers kind of help assess them and provide some training and resources to them. So for people that don't have insurance and things like that, she's sort of developed a kind of her own implementation strategy. And at University of California, Davis, Dr. Aguilar-Gacciola is our other PI. And they really work very closely with their network of Spanish-speaking community health workers and promotoras. So we've been very lucky to have that partnership. So just to show you, as we talk about training and modules, what that means, these are what our modules look like. And what's interesting is that I don't have on here that our last module, the common challenges, actually changed to common concerns? Community concerns, based on feedback from the people that took the course. So we were in constant iteration mode. We developed an online training and then got a bunch of feedback and then revised, and did the same for the facilitated training and revised. Based on the people that take the course and the champions that provide the training, we have content that's evidence-based and competency-based, but how we present that and how it's received are the things that we're most concerned about. Because again, this gets at relevance. And how are people going to receive this, and will they find this meaningful and useful to them? So we're trying to have people understand research to the point where they're comfortable enough to talk about it at some level with a community member. So we were thinking about scenarios of like, what if a community health worker is at a community site and a community member comes up and says, oh, I see a flyer for a study. Like, do you think I should join this study? We want people to have a response to that. We want people to be able to say, well, you know, here's what is sort of involved being in a research study, and know a little bit about it instead of being like, well, that's not my area, or I don't feel confident in talking about it. So even if people aren't part of teams, we really felt like this training was important for everyone to have, for everyone in that role, because that should be part of their training. And that's our goal, is really we think that it's part of their professional development. We also talk about recruitment and informed consent. Interestingly, I think it's under research basics, but we just had a conversation about randomization, and we had like a kind of like a video about like, well, what is randomization? We're trying to like make it cool, graphic and whatever, and like it wasn't really well received by the people. Like people were still kind of like, well, this doesn't really flow with the rest, and it's like a little academic. And so now we've built like a scenario of like Anna wants to enroll her friend who has breast cancer into this treatment that she thinks will work, and why can't she just give the person the treatment group? Like so it could be, so they will understand the implications of that. So so it's things like that where we think, well, how can we like take every opportunity we can and like make it a little more meaningful for the people themselves and not as academic or esoteric. And the common challenges module came up because we did this during COVID, and there was a huge issue of like, well, how do you even talk about vaccines and masks and all of this stuff? So it was very COVID heavy, and now we've tempered that a little bit, but it still gets at very important concepts about trustworthiness and where to find sources for research and how to start talking about things that are evidence-based and where to look for that. So again, about kind of sustainability for the future, we wanted the learning modules to be customizable and flexible. and we wanted these main two ways. So the champion facilitated training, we call the peer trainers champions, just to get in our lingo. But we also have, every module could be taken on its own. And that was the original idea. I don't think we're going to test it that way, but like if someone was at a community site and they were starting recruitment on a study, they could pull out the recruitment module and like teach all their people that. And that would be very in the moment relevant and specific to the role. But the way that we tested it was we had everyone do the champion facilitated training or everyone do the online training. So the champion facilitated was all the modules together. And we had English and Spanish translated versions. So we also felt that this community academic partnership was a strength, where we can use our knowledge as researchers to mentor and train these community champions. And the community champions have the strength of being embedded in community settings and having the trust. And so it's really like using the best of both people, the characteristics of both kinds of people. So the master trainer is someone who has some experience in research and can provide training and mentorship to the champions. And there was sort of an intense process to train these champions. The master trainer had to become very proficient at the training. They had to kind of mentor the champion through the process, had to observe them doing a training, kind of rate their fidelity, talk to them. It was sort of for the research, it was kind of an intense process. It probably won't be that way in the real world, but we have all the materials to do all of this training. And then the community champions would go out and train the community members. So we really strove to be collaborative in many different ways in the project. So initially, when we started to develop this, we had focus groups with many different people, both promotoras and community health workers at all the sites, trying to figure out what's going to be important to convey. We knew that we had some things that we wanted to cover, but how we would convey it were kind of our early process. We had an advisory board that were community-based leaders, largely, that also helped us understand how this could be implemented. We had content experts, largely, that were community health workers and promotoras, but also people that worked at MICHR and community engagement and other people that had slightly different lenses to help us. The community champions are the trainers. We developed train the trainer guidelines and workshops, which I saw that Dr. Piatt put as one of the implementation strategies. We did a lot of qualitative and quantitative evaluation, and the qualitative data was very informative to how we would make revisions in the course. And then just trying to have broad distribution, knowing that accessibility can be an issue, internet connection can be an issue. These are all things we were trying to kind of problem solve and think about, like how can we make this the most accessible, freely accessible resource possible. The ways that we involved community health workers and promotoras were just completely embedded in everything that we did. Input on English and Spanish translation was huge. Spanish translation is super difficult, and there's a lot of dialects, and there's a lot of phrasing, and everyone has opinions. And Dr. Aguilar-Gaxiola worked with the World Health Organization for many years doing translation and back translation, and really helped us. Like when you change something in Spanish, you actually have to revisit it in English and see if that makes sense. And we had a lot of help with translation. In fact, our main translator was a person that works in Mexican radio in California, and is really good at like plain speak, like Spanish plain speak. So she was like hugely informative in how we could make the Spanish translation high quality. And it's something that we keep getting feedback on in our qualitative feedback, is that people so much appreciate the careful consideration that we took with that, because it's not like if you go to Google Translate, you're not going to get a quality translation, and it really showed that we valued their input and really cared. So I think that's one of the ways that it feels like it's making it more relevant for the people that we intend to have this for. We also had vignettes around different things, and people helped us with like how the characters looked, the animation, what they said, the settings. We used all of their feedback. In terms of our AIM-2, we have developed initial support for effectiveness of both of the trainings. We didn't do intense knowledge checks because our users and the people at the universities didn't want them to have like exams as much as kind of taking these sort of case-based scenarios and kind of working through them. So really we largely asked about things like perceived usefulness and would you work differently and things like that. It's been very positive from the online course and from the facilitated training. We were able to train almost 400 people. So we have had a lot of eyes on this. A lot of people gave us feedback. And now we are actively revising the course based on the feedback to get it into the website version, but also into like the most content relevant and the things that we prioritize that we needed to change. And importantly, we had budget for this in the last year of the grant, that we knew that if we really wanted to make this relevant for people, we would need to have budget to make modifications according to the specifications, which was good, was a good strategy for us. So just to, again, kind of drive home out, community engagement is hugely, hugely important in making like what we think will be good implementation science. They provided feedback and support, everything from like what should we pay champions and what should we reimburse community health workers for participating in the course. Like, do we have to pay for travel? Like, do we have release time from work? Like we had a lot of different situational discussions about how this would play out in the different states because people had different roles as community health workers. Making it relevant, people supplying their own photos, their own videos. We had promotores and community health workers tape themselves talking about research, and we use those. Making things culturally and linguistically appropriate. And we actually had a lot of feedback about fonts and colors and helping with refinement of the course. And these are our dissemination manuscripts. And I think I will end there.
Right. So let's talk about why evaluate secondary implementation. So re-anchor you in our goal. So our goal is to develop and disseminate this effective, culturally and linguistically tailored, competency-based research best practices course for community health workers and promotores that Dr. Murphy just told you all about. And in doing that, we had originally planned a very different way to go about AIM-3 and disseminating materials and evaluating that. So we had originally planned really just to do a brief survey afterwards of what did you think about it? You know, nothing too focused, nothing too anchored in any framework or anything like that. And then we decided, you know what? We have an opportunity here to do good implementation early on so that as we move from our 3 sites and beyond to our secondary sites and then further beyond to that, we really want to know what works for whom and why. And you have to be very purposeful about answering those questions because if you just ask those questions broadly, people give you very broad answers. But broad answers don't move science forward. Specific answers move science forward. So that means we got to do a specific implementation evaluation. So when we think about that, context matters. I mean, there's a Per Nilsson paper from like 2014 titled Context Matters. And as clinicians, as researchers, I think that speaks inherently to us. We know that things need to vary. We know that people vary, settings vary, places vary, universities vary. So how do we acknowledge that? Part of that is by doing a purposeful evaluation. So let's identify and really seek to understand those sources of implementation variation so that we can plan for them, so that we can address them, so that we know what to do when that time comes. And then really this helps us to prepare for, as we said, the public release of materials. We want the website, we want the materials to be widely available. So what do we need in order to make that happen? How do we do our jobs well? We don't want to just do our jobs. We want to do our jobs well. And this is a really important facet of that. So I'm preaching to the choir here, but as you all know, evaluating implementation requires significant advanced planning. We have been working for months with our partners before we initiate this process to start to understand what needs to happen. They have to prepare their own protocols, their own IRB submissions. We have to figure out payment and compensation because they are our partners. We want to pay them for their time. It is a key component in community engagement, is paying people for their value. A lot of that requires very advanced planning and very purposeful conversations. These sorts of evaluations are really costly, and they are costly in terms of materials and compensation, because you're tapping a whole bunch more people for feedback, which means you're paying a whole bunch more people for feedback. But then also it's time intensive. A lot of times you are doing not only a quantitative evaluation, but a qualitative evaluation. And if you've done qualitative work, you know it takes a long time. And then when you do community engaged based qualitative work like we do, where you involve a community member in the coding process to really anchor your understanding in their world, it takes even longer. We would have done our qualitative, for example, our qualitative evaluation would have been done a month ago had we not decided to involve a community member who is now just getting onboarded, and we are working on training her in how to code and how to do qualitative analysis, because it really just brings that much wealth to our understanding. I'm not a community health worker. I'm an occupational therapist. I know what it's like to function and to talk to people, but not within that role. I still speak heavily in medical jargon, even though I don't intend to. It just happens because that's who I am. So having community members involved in the actual analysis itself can be really valuable, just takes a lot of time. But it's really beneficial. This is a great way to get buy-in from your collaborators and your partners. You are showing them that they matter. You are putting your actual money where your mouth is by involving them in the process. And that's really critical and a really important step for implementation that we know, but we don't really act on. And then you can glean just a ton of information through these conversations. You understand context-specific needs. So we're implementing this in different sites, very different sites across the country. UT Rio Grande Valley in Texas, Oregon Health Sciences University, and University of South Carolina. Those are three remarkably different sites with remarkably different needs. So by engaging them in this process, we can learn about them. We can also understand variations in implementation. People do things differently. That's okay. We just need to understand why and how so that we can measure that, so that we can plan for it, so that we know what's happening. And then, again, we can further refine materials and processes, because a lot about implementation is evaluating process. It's not just the thing, it's how people do the thing, just like Gretchen said. So we gotta look at that. And I didn't talk to Gretchen about this, but here are Proctor's implementation domains, and that's very much what's framing our understanding of our outcomes currently. I have 7 of them. Sustainability is beyond the scope of our current project. We're in the last year of a grant. We're in the last 3 months of the grant, so we don't have the time scope to really evaluate sustainability, but that's something that we're interested in doing, potentially informally, potentially in another grant coming down the road, is to really purposefully look at sustainability. So when you look at penetration, it's community health workers and promotors trained. The denominator is the number that's employed by an organization. We're looking at adoption, fidelity, acceptability, appropriateness, and feasibility through surveys, observation reports, and interviews. Then you have those 3 specific intervention measures to look at acceptability of the intervention measure, appropriateness of the intervention, and then feasibility. And then we're also looking at cost, because cost is something that really matters. I don't know if it's an American thing, but we just don't like to talk about dollars. We know they matter, but we don't talk about them in any purposeful sense. So we're doing a resource interview where we talk about what resources are available to them to support this intervention, what they might need, what we at our 3 CTSA funded institutions, what we can offer them in support. And so those are really important. And then we will actually have their invoices to the University of Michigan, so we will actually have a dollar value to know how much it costs for them to employ the people to help disseminate and run this program. Fidelity is really important, right? As Dr. Piatt said, fidelity matters. We need to know when people are doing something that they're doing it the way that it's intended, because that's how we know it works. So we have that in a couple of different ways. We have our champions who do a post-training survey talking about their experience being trained. engaging their readiness to teach. It's on a 1 to 10 scale. If they rate their readiness as a 4, well, I was a master trainer for this project. If they rated a 4, I know there's some further education, some further practice that we need to get into. We do training session reports after the champions lead a training session with our community health worker or promotora learners. They then do a training session report. They provide details, attendance, what went well, what didn't go well, what hiccups they encountered. So this is how we start to understand some variation, especially in our in-person delivery versus our online or Zoom delivery. Is really helpful to have those details. And they do it fresh, like within a couple of hours of finishing the training. And then we also, as master trainers, have actual fidelity rating forms where we go through and look at kind of the essential elements of the training course. Did they meet them? And then we rate them from 1 to 10. So that's how we're evaluating fidelity. But let's talk about evaluating this kind of secondary implementation, as we're calling it. So we have this demographics and resource interview, which really is a conversation with the site lead. And that's going to be done at the beginning of the project, and that's a conversation. What resources are available at your organization? What are the demographics of that organization? In order to know about our context, we actually have to ask questions about the context. Not all of those things are publicly available. So we have questions about that, and I'll show you kind of a rundown of what that looks like. We collaborated with one of our partners, one of our secondary implementation partners, to help design this so that it is relevant, because University of Michigan is a very different bear from University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. So the questions that we might think about our organization may not be relevant to the way their organization is structured. So we involved him in that, as well as our master trainers and champions, because our collaborators are busy people, and we need to be very cognizant of as little burden as possible. So this conversation, 15 to 20 minutes, that's what we expect it to take. Then after the CHWs, after the promotoras and community health workers do the training, they'll do a training evaluation survey, and that's where we get some concrete feedback and general experiences and perceptions about the training. That's usually done pretty quick. Then kind of the two big pieces where we're really going to get a lot of information are from our qualitative interviews. So we're going to do qualitative interviews with study participants, with the community health workers and promotoras themselves, maybe 1 to 2 per each secondary implementation site, just so we get some information. And that really has allowed us to really get a lot of information in how we need to refine our materials. What are the sticking points? What do people really dislike? Or what do they really love and they want to see more of? So we're getting a lot of that feedback in both directions. And then also we're going to do interviews with kind of the 4, what I would argue are the 3 levels of kind of collaborator at the academic site. So that's your master trainer, your champion, and your site lead. Those are the people at the academic site who are helping to disseminate this with their community health workers. And so we're going to get very different questions from that. And I want to show you how we're going to get different information from all of this. So our demographics and resource interview. This is what we're going to ask about. So we want to understand, what's their relationship with the academic system? Do you have a formal relationship? Do you not? Because we know that can affect infrastructure and support. Who are the communities the organizations serve? Community health worker organizations serve very different people in very different ways. And so we want to know, who are the communities you serve? And that can be based on location. Geographic location could be based on the age. So do they focus on early intervention? Do they focus on keeping older adults at home? You know, what's the focus of their organization? As well as, do they have a topic focus? A lot of our organizations seem to focus on LGBTQIA+ population, so that's something we need to consider. Maternal health, UT Rio Grande Valley is deeply invested in maternal health, so that's a focus of them. So we want to know, who are these people reaching so that we can best tailor our information and make sure they have what they need. Then we're getting very concrete information about demographics of the organization. Like I said, how many administrative staff do you have? Because we've seen at our 3 sites how that affects your site's ability to do something. What's the number of community health workers or promotoras that they employ, and in what capacities, what languages do they speak, and then if they have any prior involvement in research. Because you could imagine an organization that has some experience and some exposure to research, it may be easier for them to get on board with this kind of research best practices training. And if they have any funding, because funding matters. All right, so our qualitative interviews, I just kind of given you some bullet points for these. So of our organization leaders or our site lead, we want to know what is their overall impression of their training and the implementation processes. What resources and support did they need from Michigan in order to get this done well, and what barriers and facilitators did they perceive? As opposed to master trainers who are going to give us very different types of information. They're going to talk about the experience selecting, because what we learned, you have to be very purposeful in your selection of these champions. If they are going to be doing facilitated online training via Zoom, they really better have some decent computer skills. That was a significant problem when we had to train a champion, and we actually had to back out of that relationship because that person was going to need 50, 60 hours of basic computer tech training in order to be able to effectively teach. So real-world scenarios that you might not think about but really matter. So we then also want to learn about barriers and facilitators of the training experience and what it's like delivering the training, because a lot of times the master trainers will observe or be engaged in that process as well, and then get feedback on that. Then we're engaging the champions themselves in interviews. What was their experience with the trainer-trainer process, delivering the trainings, barriers and facilitation and facilitators? What adaptations did they make? Because we know people change things. We know people make adaptations. We just have to acknowledge it. And then give us feedback on training materials and process. And then from our learners, we're going to get a lot of feedback on the training experience, content, materials, and refinement, what needs to happen, how do we make things more relevant. We give a certificate of completion, and arguably a lot of people assume those don't matter. They really matter to this population. And so we're getting a lot of really valuable feedback that can serve this project and other projects that we do with community members. And then they are a hotbed of information for here's how you give this to other community health workers and promoters. So they've given us a lot of help for dissemination. Real briefly, if you're all into intervention or into implementation, you've probably seen these 3 measures. They are brief, they are quick. We will be disseminating these to folks before their qualitative interviews, so that then in the qualitative interviews themselves, we can probe and ask specific details about their feedback. What do we expect from all of this? Well, we expect to get our course evaluation as well as an evaluation of its implementation itself, because there's the thing and what the thing does, then there's how we do the thing and how we get that thing across. 2 very separate questions, 2 very important outcomes. Hopefully, we will identify sources of variation in that implementation among our additional sites. As we saw through our 3 original sites, we did things very differently, so we have to acknowledge how that changes and why, and if that's acceptable or not. We hope to establish potential implementation strategies for future wide-scale implementation. So from our interviews, what can we glean in order to understand what implementation strategies may be effective or interesting to our community partners in our future collaborations? And we'll get additional refinements, as well as new sites for future collaboration, which is always really important. If you do this well, people want to work with you. You become the problem solver. This is a room of doers. This is a team full of doers. People are attracted to that. They want help solving problems. So this is a great way to get that done. So let's talk about enhancing real-world translation. Dr. Murphy had said, all right, so research, design, and development often doesn't involve community partners. Boy, did we change that. They're integrated from every step of the way, from conception through implementation, and will be involved in another implementation evaluation. The lack of appropriate and specific training really matters because we're expecting people to do a job with us. We have to train our team members to be effective team members. I mean, half of us are probably clinicians in this space. We learn from others, watching others, being mentored by others. We need to engage that for all team members in our team science. And we have to embed mentorship. A lot of times, that's one of the benefits of our community academic partnership, is our being able to mentor this. But there's also mentorship for me. It's not just for the community health workers and promoters themselves. I'm getting mentorship. Dr. Murphy's getting mentorship. It's about meaningful collaboration without hierarchy. I think that's really a key component to community engaged implementation science. There is no hierarchy. We are all just trying to solve a problem. We all have very different perspectives and values to bring to the table, and it's the only way we're going to solve the real world problems that we have. So you also can enhance real world translation. Integrate your partners through the process. Be sincere Be genuine, be authentic. You know, people can see through the garbage, so don't try to fake it. Be honest. Give them appropriate role-specific training. If that is the outcome of the thing you're doing, make sure you have people on your team who can help speak to that thing. Help build capacity. This is a capacity building experience, right? We are trying to change the community health worker program to our workforce training because it better serves research for all of us. Give mentorship, help people feel like they have the skills, continue to build those relationships and embed mentorship throughout your opportunities, and then just be really purposeful about your approach to implementation and evaluation. Be purposeful. If you're gonna do something in 2 languages, involve somebody in that who speaks that second language as their primary language, because it really makes a difference. I have never been involved in so many conversations where accent matters. Like in the United States, the Midwest accent is arguably like a neutral accent. What I learned is there's no real neutral accent for Spanish speakers. It varies so differently. So in our snippets and in our scenarios, we are having voice actors who speak Colombian Spanish, Mexican Spanish, not so much Spain Spanish, because that's just not where our partners are from, but it's a very purposeful conversation. Be purposeful in your implementation, who you're involving, what questions you're asking. The more specific your question, the more specific your information. And that's all we've got.
You have a few minutes for questions.
Oh, okay. Any questions?
Please.
I have a question for you, please. You mentioned that you are using the leader and colleagues outcome to measure the feasibility of the IAM, the FIM, and the...
IAM, the AIM, and as a rehab therapist, FIM means something very different from me, but yes, we'll call it the feasibility of implementation measure, yeah.
But I'm curious to know what measures you're going to use for other outcomes, because you mentioned like you're going to use like 7 out of the 8 outcomes in the proctored outcome. So like you mentioned survey and observation.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious to know which survey you're going to use. Are you going to build one from scratch, or are you going to use a valid and reliable one? And for the observation, how are you going to do the observation report?
Sure. So the observation reports are specific for fidelity. That's how we measure fidelity. And we video record all of the online trainings. So as a master trainer, I've watched more than my fair share of actual like 8-hour-long trainings to see what's being done. So that's how we measure fidelity. In terms of the adoption, the acceptability, appropriateness, feasibility, those are open-ended questions in the survey that we're just asking about. And then we have the 3 quantitative measures, as you saw there. So if you have recommendations for very specific measures or very, well-made guidelines, we're always open to what resources we haven't thought of. But yeah, it's going to be very open-ended for a lot of it. And then the acceptability, appropriateness, and feasibility is the quantitative measure. Yeah. That's a good question. Thank you. Please.
First of all, thank you. This was so interesting. My question is about those quantitative measures like the AIM and the FIM and all of those, and translating those to a different language when some of those constructs seem very similar. Something is appealing, and I welcome it, and I like it. Translating that into Spanish, have you struggled with that level of nuance in a different language?
That's a great question. So these have not yet gone out to our Spanish translator. Like that's happening next week. So yeah, but it's a really important thought, because you're right. In English, there's like real minor nuance in some of those questions. So that's a great question. It's probably something I'll ask Maria in advance of.
Yeah.
Hey, do these still make sense? Because in the past, she has told us when we give her stuff to translate, she'll write, this doesn't. I'm not sure it means what you want it to mean, and then we have a conversation about that. That's a great
Yeah.
question.
That makes us need to start that sooner rather than
Yeah.
later.
Let's say,
Please.
sorry, one more
Okay.
thing. My colleague, Emma Lawrence, has done this in Ghana,
Okay.
where you also have a second language, but English is primary, but maybe not quite the same nuance. And it's a struggle. Suitability, applicability, and fitting.
Right.
So just as an implementation science community, thinking about, yes, these are sort of the gold standard for measuring appropriateness and acceptability, but boy, once you get into a different second language, it's especially challenging.
You're right, and I think that really speaks to the value of having a conversation afterwards, having the qualitative follow-up, having the interview. And I'm a mixed methodologist at heart. I believe that quantitative data should almost always be followed by qualitative data if you actually want to understand the truth behind your numbers. That's my paradigm, my philosophy. And so that's what we're embracing here because I'm designing it. So engage people on your team who have complementary and different philosophies from you. They will only strengthen your team further.
So maybe we can just do questions after, are we running out of time? Because we can just talk to people after.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. So let's give it a round of applause. So thanks again, and now we're going to get to our next phase of this. We are really blessed to have, oh, you need something, Lisa? No. Oh, slides, yes, sure. Okay, she'll fix, okay, I'll just talk while. So we'll then now go into our breakouts. And so basically, one thing I just want to point out from all we've heard about so far is the end game here is sustainability. And to get there is imagine you're working with a community partner or a community organization or or just a region. You want them to own and take your intervention, your thing, to the next level. And so much of this is really understanding how we got here. And some of the success stories, I mean, what we see here are some very dynamic implementation scientists who will kind of talk about what their thing is and what they want to do to get it implemented. So think about the end of the day, what it will look like. What does this look like? It's really having that toolkit so that community members can own the implementation of the thing and be able to measure its success. So it's really basically breaking down the steps, what you need to do to get there. So right now we're going to have a 10-minute break. So promptly at 10:30, you'll be convening into 3 different breakouts. So in the back here, we have Dr. Rebecca Hassan, who is going to be basically talking about her intervention for physical activity for kids and families in homes. And then we also, on this corner, we have Dr. Jackie Hawkins, who will be basically talking about her intervention on diabetes self-management. Here, we'll turn this off. And then finally, last but certainly not least, Cheryl and Emma will be talking about their maternal health intervention in Ghana. Now, they're lucky enough to be right by the food, but try to, if you can, steal your bagel before they do. No, just kidding. But do actually try to self-congregate so we can have some evenness across the groups. I'm sure they'll greatly appreciate that. So we'll take a 10-minute break and then at 10:30 reconvene, and then we'll spend an hour talking with them. They're going to be basically designing their implementation studies, and we'll be coming back at 11:30, and the facilitators who will be helping each of our esteemed faculty talk about their implementation studies will come back and then basically report out what the implementation study looked like. So thank you and good luck. Have fun. I'll start first. Well, thanks everyone for coming back. Thank you for Dr. Hawkins' group for enjoying, hopefully you enjoyed the sun out there. I think appreciate your grace of separating ourselves more so we can all hear each other. I know it's a challenge, but it's not a bad problem to have when we have so many people. So at this point, we're going to recap and provide each of us, Gretchen, Ram, and myself, will provide a brief summary of what we learned and what our experience was with our breakouts. So I'm sure that you all had some really interesting discussions and more questions, and you probably came up with 50 different study designs. But basically, this time is really, we're going to spend probably the rest of the next 20 or so minutes, and then we'll get you out by lunch. And then please, at the end, please take whatever food's left because we have plenty of it. So I think in general, what I'll do is maybe I'll start first and just give kind of really a recap of what we learned from Rebecca and her intervention impact and how to get it implemented in homes. So, basically, Rebecca was kind enough to actually draw a really elaborate study design already. And I'm going to explain what was really cool about this design in part because it was really meant to be a public health intervention in ways that we haven't imagined. And what was really cool and creative about this was she already had infrastructure in place to be able to work and engage with a community, let's say Michigan, to roll out on a statewide level videos of exercise physical activity programs for kids and their parents at home. And so wanted to find out what were the best methods or strategies to get people to actually see and use the videos and get the kids moving, essentially. So we had a really, really in-depth discussion of, what are some things that are going to motivate people to use these videos and motivate parents particularly. And we talked about the challenges of, there might be some cheap implementation strategies, really inexpensive ones, such as, pinging people on the phone. And on the one hand, how many times you get reminders on the phone, you just sort of delete, whatever. On the other hand, if they're motivational and couched in a way that are, savvy, then, I'm probably more likely to pay attention to them. We also talked about some really creative tailoring of videos and maybe even having, for example, some sports figures, maybe doing some of them. And Rebecca, you have to correct me if I'm wrong on anything like this, but we were really going over some really creative ideas of what the strategies would look like. And one of the first things I remember hearing was, is this an implementation study? And absolutely it is, because the thing that you were trying to implement essentially was physical activity for kids. The stuff you do to help people use the thing are essentially the smartphone reminders, the coaching, and the tailoring of different interventions. Tailoring is an implementation strategy. So think about that. You have to think creatively about really couching what you're doing and spinning it to NIH, for example, so that they know that what you're doing is innovative. We then talked about how to actually bring in motivational interviewing and how to really help people if, again, the parents were experiencing barriers to physical activity. And this is where this type of design really gets cool. And I hope you all just take a chance to kind of look at this as an example. But the beauty of doing an implementation study is that everybody in a community gets access to the thing. It's physical activity. And what you're doing is you're randomizing different ways of delivering the thing. So you might have a randomization where you first randomize and parents get maybe a phone reminder or they get a tailored video. And so it's different ways of delivering the thing. But then for people who might need a little bit more help in sort of using physical activity in a household, then you can basically randomize them to receive a motivational interview coach. And imagine, and this is where it gets really interesting around sustainability, she was talking about having that person that might be contacting maybe by video chat or however media, that person could be a reimbursable service through pediatrics. That is really the road to sustainability, that if you can make your implementation strategy reimbursable by a health plan or a program, you've got essentially, you are on your way to sustainability. So I'll just recap as we just really had a great discussion. I really want to thank our group about these ideas, and really I thank Rebecca for really being up front and center and subjecting herself to a lot of inquisitive people. So anything else you want to add?
No, just thank you for your creative thoughts and innovation, and we will definitely be tailoring based on your responses, so thank you.
Great. Okay. All right. Great. I'll move on. So Gretchen, you want to go next? Or?
Sure. I'll just sit right here since this microphone's right in my mouth. So I facilitated Jackie Hawkins' breakout session, and Jackie's work is very focused in diabetes self-management support efforts for Black men with type 2 diabetes. And Jackie has been working on developing an implementation study to be submitted in June. So this was very timely that she was able to get the feedback from the group. And the group talked a lot about the differences between hybrid type 1, type 2, and type 3 implementation trials. And just real quickly, so a hybrid type 1 trial is one where you're mostly just focused on effectiveness of the intervention, and you're only maybe a little bit curious about implementation. Maybe you're just dabbling in it. A hybrid type 2 is when you're just as interested in effectiveness as you are in implementation. And then a hybrid type 3 is when you're really more focused on implementation than you are effectiveness. You already know that your evidence is effective, and you want to know why it's effective and how it's effective. So the group was very in agreement that Jackie's study is probably a hybrid type 2, where she would have, co-primary outcomes, one around effectiveness of a curriculum that we have, and that effectiveness would probably be something very typical in diabetes, so like change in average blood sugar levels, change or improvement in psychosocial outcomes, things like that. And then just as much emphasis on the implementation outcomes. So is this feasible to do? Do people accept it? And on and on. So in terms of the setting of where the study would take place, she is prepared to collaborate with federally qualified health centers in Detroit. There was some questions there around, should it be in these federally qualified health centers and Michigan Medicine, or should it be in these federally qualified health centers or Michigan Medicine? And like I mentioned to the group and I mentioned to Jackie, in my opinion, it should be just in the federally qualified health centers for a variety of different reasons that we don't have time to get into. The population will be Black men with type 2 diabetes. The evidence that Jackie will be implementing is an established peer leader curriculum that has been developed, was developed about 12 years ago in our Department of Learning Health Sciences by some colleagues of mine. And it has been shown to be effective over and over and over again. We talked a lot about the different strategies that she would use to implement that curriculum. One big thing that we focused on was the sustainability piece in terms of getting this to be sustained in those federally qualified health centers. And similar to what Amy talked about with Rebecca's project, the same thing comes up in that these services that peer leaders, in this case, in Jackie's case, provide do need to become a billable service in some way, shape, or form. Now, I will say that Michigan is ahead of many, many states in terms of being able to get the services of community health workers to be reimbursed. And there's a very strong community health worker network in Michigan called MICHR. And they've been very progressive in getting reimbursable services into their everyday lives. And then finally, Jackie's plan is to use mixed methods to evaluate the study, collecting a lot of qualitative data on the determinants of implementing the curriculum, and also quantitative data on the effectiveness outcomes and the implementation outcomes, and all of that data collection and evaluation being wrapped up in the REAIM evaluation framework. So that was what we talked about. I don't know where Jackie is, but if any of you, yeah, maybe. If any of you are in the group and have additional things to add, I'd love to hear from you. Okay, I'll turn it over to Rama.
All right, and so I had the opportunity to facilitate the third breakout group, and that was led by both Cheryl and Emma. And, when asked to facilitate this, personally, I was, pretty thrilled to do so, not only because it was really amazing and engaging and interesting work in concept, but also in implementation in the work that had been done. And so, I found myself essentially being an implementation science cheerleader, primarily because, Emma at first didn't realize that her work was actually within the vein and the realm of implementation science. So going back to what Amy kicked us off with in the very beginning of this talk, we all actually have it. We all conduct implementation science work intuitively. It's just now understanding the formalization around it. and how to frame it and present it in that manner. So Emma, wherever you are in this room, go you, and that goes to Cheryl as well. So the discussion really centered around the background of the problem, which was improving frequent high-fidelity blood pressure monitoring in pregnancy for women at high risk for hypertensive disorders. The problem in itself was, presented a lot of the context around the challenge. Cheryl and Emma actually proceeded to creating a implementation research logic model. This was Cheryl's first one, and once again, as their self-appointed cheerleader, I must say it was very well done, yes, bravo. As it really spurred some great conversation within the group that was very organic. So the purpose for this implementation research logic model was really to support the pursuit of a grant that they wanted to apply for this upcoming summer, particularly around mHealth innovations for low resource contexts. The idea was to actually create a home-based blood pressure monitoring system for pregnant women at risk of preeclampsia and eclampsia. And we went through this logic model by first understanding the determinants of the issue, right? Proceeded then to understanding or having a discussion around the strategies used to ameliorate those determinants. And we focused on the modifiable strategies or the modifiable issues that were modifiable. So, for example, we had three in particular. Number one, their work identified that engaging family members' adherence to capturing and collecting this data was a challenge amongst women at home. Secondly, numeracy issues with regards to interpretation was also another key issue. So, for example, it's one thing to be able to record your blood pressure, but it's another thing to actually understand and interpret that it's high or low or you're at risk. And then lastly, the key issue of having a centralized system of reporting and capturing this data, interpreting it, and actually then communicating back to our patients. So we focused on the two modifiable ones, which included adherence and the numeracy component. And the core implementation strategies that were discussed in this discussion were electronic patient reminders to monitor at home, as well as engaging family members to assist women in monitoring. And that's because a lot of the pilot work that was conducted revealed that patients or pregnant women who had family members supporting them at home were actually more likely to record their blood pressure, and also had the opportunity to have support in terms of numeracy interpretation issues. The key final implementation outcomes that were discussed were how could we potentially now think about additional strategies to support adherence and thinking about ways to operationalize the implementation outcomes of fidelity. And that is because, as I found out, since this was very new to me, that taking blood pressure recordings is actually incredibly sensitive, and it requires, a 10-step checklist. If I'm remembering correctly, it requires a 10-step checklist, specific body positioning in order to ensure that the data that you're capturing is accurate. Because from a physician's perspective, if the data is inaccurate, you might as well not have done any of this work to begin with. So we had very spirited discussions around it, specifically around considering a variety of other strategies, using cues and visual aids to support the interpretation, thinking about letting the patients actually design and co-design the messaging that would remind them, thinking about actually capturing Polaroids or taking Polaroid pictures of pregnant women in the appropriate position so that they could actually have something to remind them at home, and also creating prenatal communities whereby pregnant women could potentially partner up and pair up in going on this journey, which is a very long 9-month journey together. So all in all, I think it's safe to say that we had a very good discussion, and the group has great ideas that they'll be able to take forward in their grants coming forward. So appreciate everyone who was in the group, and I'll have pom-poms next time. So,
Well, thank you so much, Rama. And let's just give a round of applause to all of our three scientists and our facilitators as well. Thank you. Oh, you have a slide. Okay, so Lisa's up here to have a slide. Okay.
Oh, whoops. There we go.
Oh, great. So thank you, Jim, for attending our second Implementation Science Network event. I had a couple just brief remarks, but I also wanted to take this time as well to, is Athena McKay here? Hey, how you doing? Good, great. Well, please come up. I want you to actually tell us about one of the next events through MICHR. As you're coming up, I'll just mention, as a reminder, do complete our post-event survey, download our various and sundry resources, and save the date for November 8th, which is a Friday of this year, for our next Implementation Science Networking event. And Ms. McKay, please, if you'd like to come up to the podium, please tell us about another exciting event coming up fairly soon.
Good afternoon. You guys out there? Good afternoon. My name is Athena McKay. I'm a program manager at MICHR, as Amy mentioned, the Michigan Institute for Clinical Health and Research. I have the tremendous opportunity to share with you a dynamic tool. I have pom-poms too, Rama. So it is the Michigan Research Engaging the Academy in Community in Health, which is called MREACH. You got some goodies on your table. So the information I'll share is also on this postcard. We love engagement. So we have a USB. And this little gadget here, does anyone know what this is?
To not touch buttons and stuff.
Thank you. Of course, Gretchen would know. It is called a clean key. Of course, this mechanism came through the Flint water crisis. I'm a Flint resident, or Greater Flint resident. One of the things that we often said to researchers, so I'm putting on my community hat for a moment, is that our information is not being heard and distributed equally. Also, we moved through COVID-19. Resources came to our community. We worked together collaboratively with MICHR, with community engagement, to create this tool. What MREACH is a dynamic tool which provides a network for community and academic partners to connect. You're able to create a profile, a professional profile. In that profile, you're able to list your interests, topics of interest for research, the populations that you like to study, as well as those focus areas and regions within the state. The platform highlights resources. So all of these great tools and interventions that you're creating, we would love to house them in MREACH so that we can share them broadly. Also events, such as this event was listed in MREACH, and other interested parties in the community. There is a platform for community partners as well as researchers or academics, so you can cruise through those profiles to see if there's some matches, some interests that you would like to engage with. We don't share your email, so it's not placid on there. You can, not anonymously, but you can privately email. So I know this young lady here had the opportunity to work with Alex and Dr. Murphy on that best practice survey and study that we heard about earlier. If I wanted to reach out to Alex, I could email her privately, say, yes, I am very interested in doing more work with you based on our matched interests. Either Alex could or not decide to respond and make that connection. We also have the opportunity at community engagement to help you with consultations. So you've heard a lot of information today. What's next? We at community engagement can be that bridge for you to help you get community partners on board. As Julie mentioned, the end user is so important in these iterative processes. And without their input, it's going to be just another really cute, expensive research project that sits on the shelf. So we welcome you and ask you to join MREACH and join us in the journey to community engagement. Thank you.
So a lot going on, and as you can tell, some of our best ideas come from community members. So we're here. Thank you again. Please fill out any post-conference survey. We look forward to seeing you at our next events, and good luck with all your implementation endeavors. Thank you very much for being here.